you, and thank you for joining us. Now, it wasn't too long ago that the US urged China to step up its global role. Today, I think there is consensus that China has, and perhaps has exceeded, that it made the US a little uncomfortable. If you take a look at what happened in January, President Xi Jinping, he said, it is time that China guides the economic globalization. Then he went on to say that there is a China solution for global issues. And of course, over the last 3 years, we've seen China extend its influence. It created the new development bank, AIIB. It also was behind RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and OBOR, One Belt, One Road, possibly the single largest coordinated investment initiative that we have ever seen, spanning 65 countries across Europe and Asia, what they deem as the Silk Route. Now, with the US retreating, is China creating a new world order? And if it is the world ready for it? Well, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers today. Please join in welcoming Lawrence Ho, Melco International CEO and Chairman. Elaine LaRoche, China International Capital Corp. US Securities CEO. Mike Perlis, Forbes Media CEO and Executive Chairman. And Bin Chi, China Investment Corp. Executive Vice President, by the way, China's version of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Now, let's start with Lawrence. Are we seeing a new world order? Is China already in the driver's seat?
Well, I think if you look at China and what they've done with One Belt, One Road and the AIIB initiatives, it has really about interconnectivity. And if you look at what President Xi Jinping said at Davos, he said that they really want the population and the wealth of China to benefit many countries. And if you look at One Belt, One Road, it involves over 65 countries, and it could potentially benefit 4.4 billion people. And so I don't think there is like we said earlier on, it's not a zero-sum game between the US and China. I think China, given its population and the wealth that is created, is trying to exert its influence, but at the same time, promote interconnectivity. And for China, these initiatives are 40-year-long, long-term commitments and long-term relationships.
So are we already seeing this new world order?
I think we are moving.
Is China a superpower from your perspective?
Well, I think from an economic standpoint, China certainly is a superpower. If you look at the capital being deployed all around the world, not just One Belt, One Road, even in the US, a lot of companies in the US are much more open to Chinese capital.
Dr. Chi, when you take a look at China playing a leadership role, I mean, you're connected to the government and the ins and outs in China. Is China trying to play a more influential role within the current system, within the current world order, or is it trying to challenge the US in this leadership role?
Well, I think the system itself is always evolving. It's just you don't see a system which will be there like forever. So therefore, I think what's happening in China is really focusing on its own development, just trying to grow the economy, and also China is trying to excuse me to establish a sort of like a different order or anything. I just think China is just want to, develop the economy and propel China into a more modernized or civilized society. And by doing that, I think, of course, you're going to have engagement between Chinese economy and the rest of the world. And I think I totally agree with Andrew that it's benefiting both sides. We all learn, from, economics 101, what's the beauty of free market economy is that it's no longer a zero-sum game. As we can see from, the economic engagement in the previous, couple of decades, and also for the years to come. I think what President Xi said in the Davos conference was really, in some sense, very inspiring. That particularly given that there's so much noise these days on globalization and free trade, and I think he tried to defend globalization and free trade. I think which is right. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think still the economic engagement and free trade is going to solve the, be it clash of civilization or whatever problem we're having in this world. So I think what's going on here in China, either with the One Belt One Road initiative or whatever other free trade framework within Asia, I think they're just positive not only for China but also going to benefit the rest of the world.
Just to be clear, though, just so I get it right, I mean, it's not a zero-sum game, but is China creating this new world order? Does it want to play this leadership role? Is it challenging the U.S.? You're saying no.
Well, from my point of view, from what I understand, I don't think there's somebody there trying to do this purposely. Come on. I think China is just, there are 1.3 billion of Chinese people who try to have a better life. As simple as that.
Elaine, you disagree though, right?
Well, I agree with Qibin on the first point, which is that the primary focus of the Chinese leadership is to elevate the standing and the economic wherewithal of its people, and as well to promote social stability within China and on its borders. But if you remember Chinese history, China did rule the world many, many years ago. And there is a natural desire for China to have a seat at the table once again. And I think that's a fair request, and I think that is the first step. But that's not an issue of power or takeover or challenging the United States. Because with power, as we all know, comes accountability and responsibility. And right now, internally within China, I think the focus of the government and of the party is really internal to the development of the Chinese society and its people. But China has also had a history of long-term views, of very sweeping initiatives, and I think it's still very early, and the jury is out because it will be in its execution where, looking back in retrospect, we will see how successful they will be.
Is China already taking the right steps? Because if you take a look at RCEP, it's an alternative to the TPP. If you take a look at OBOR, One Belt, One Road, it's already signed a deal. I mean, deals worth $1 trillion since its inception. It's made further commitment to the UN by doubling the number of peacekeeping forces. I mean, it does seem like China is heading in the right direction. Do you feel the same way?
I think that there are steps that are being taken in a positive direction.
But more needs to be done.
More needs to be done. I mean, it's very easy, and China has spent lavishly around the world on financial investments. But one might argue that the talk and the walk is very different. The types of investments that have been made in terms of aggregating natural resources or what's been done in Africa, some may argue may not have been done in what the West might view as a really positive economic development. So I think that there's a very big difference between just financial investment as a barometer of success versus, in fact, looking at this in a much more holistic fashion.
Is it inevitable, Mike? I mean, this is a $21 trillion economy, the biggest exporter in the world, second largest importer, 1.5 billion people. Well, close to 1.5 billion people. Is it inevitable that China will play this role eventually, if not now, sometime in the future, don't know, 10, 20 years down the road?
It's awfully hard to see into the future, but as we were discussing a little bit earlier, so many of those signs point in that direction. If I can personalize it just for a moment, take a slightly different view of this relative to the term superpower. Forbes is almost 100 years old. And 3 years ago, we sold a majority stake in Forbes to a Hong Kong-based company. So for me, the notion of Asia, what China means, has become very different. And in my life, it is a superpower, defined differently. We make decisions with a different mindset than we did before. And I suspect that at every company where there's been investment from China, and that number is growing all the time in so many different sectors. That mindset shift is taking place, and it certainly has for us. For instance, we shifted from a 15-year history of licensing our media brand in China to ending that licensing relationship and starting a fully owned subsidiary that we control, that with ownership in Hong Kong we feel very differently about than we did 3 years ago. So I think many things point towards this continued growth, but I just wanted to add a sort of personal screen for someone who's has investment from there now. It takes on a different tone and a different feel. We'll talk more about that.
In your view, what would you like to see China do to help it play this role and be accepted by the global community, especially by Elaine?
I'd like them to do everything they can to help me succeed at Forbes. I'm not sure I'm going to walk into your question of what do I want them to do to become the next superpower.
I mean, in terms of transparency, I mean, you're in publishing. Mm-hmm. I mean...
It's really interesting. I think that Elaine hit on something. We're a 300-year-old economy, as a serious economy in the United States. Actually, this book that Jonathan Pomfret wrote, The Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom, focuses on the different styles that the United States and China have based on a 300-year history and a 4,000 or 5,000 year history. The approach that you alluded to in terms of style is very pronounced, often patient, much more fluid. I find that my group and my team are in an odd sort of position of being in much more of a hurry. So much is happening so fast in China, but there's also a patience and a belief that in an odd way, if we build it, it will come. And I agree. I don't think there's a mastermind pulling the strings. I think it's cultural, and I think it's real, and I think it's happening, but it'll happen in its own time.
Is there a sense that Trump's isolationist policies are making China's form of leadership more acceptable? I mean, just take a look at Chinese investments. I mean, Chinese investments in Africa, for instance, exceeds that of the US and Europe. Take a look at the Philippines. Despite what's happening in the South China Sea, China and the Philippines have struck a deal through investment.
Mm-hmm. But I don't think you can just look at the total amount of financial investment, because we're so trained to looking at economic returns on that investment. And in China, you have to look at many of the investments that are being made in terms of social returns or policy returns. So when you think of the banking system in China, it is very much a driver of policy initiatives and orientation. Whether in the West we think that's right or wrong, whether or not we think that Chinese state-owned enterprises have an unfair advantage because they have subsidized capital to create this foreign investment, I think so. It really is looking at apples and oranges. And so that's why I didn't mean to convey negativity. I think it's just the question is that we have to look at things in the same light. And it is very different. So you can't just look at the the amount of total foreign investment that the Chinese have made. Are they economic returns? So when you look at AAIB, which I think is terrific, because Chairman Jin is trying to build a multilateral organization that has a very lean staff and is not bloated like the World Bank and the IMF. But in the end, the bottom line is, are the investments that they're going to be making drivers of future economic development? Are they going to be really making those investments where there will be financial and economic returns for the countries in which they're made? And that, I would say, the jury is still out. They've just made their first investments here in the last years. So this is a longer-term process. Did they take the initiative in creating a multilateral organization that is structured differently than the existing ones? Yes. Is that a very positive development? Absolutely. Okay. But as all things in China, how these organizations run in the future, when the leadership of that organization changes, may also change. The World Bank doesn't change that much when there's a new World Bank leader. In China, sometimes that can happen.
And we're on the cusp of a leadership change.
That's correct.
Your views on that, Lawrence?
No, I think ultimately with China, you've got to take the good with the bad. And it's, if you look at the track record over the last 30 years, China has brought 500 million people into the middle class within China. Now, I was telling you earlier on, the first time I went to China, because I live in Hong Kong, I grew up in the West, in 1987, it literally looked like a picture of North Korea today. Mm-hmm. And imagine how much work they've done in 30 years and China is probably more capitalistic than most countries nowadays. But in terms of how the government, state-owned enterprises, and some of the quasi-agencies, how they conduct themselves, we need to be patient with them. And in line with my business, I'm in the hospitality business. And even in the last 10 years, we have seen a behavioral pattern change in our customers. So 10 years ago, our mainland Chinese customer base, which is effectively over 85% of our business, I'm in the gaming sector, it was very different than it is right now. 10 years ago, they didn't care about the Michelin star restaurants. They didn't care about how many Forbes travel stars you had. And now all of the operators are fighting over that. And we're very proud at Melco Resorts to have the most Forbes 5 stars in Macau, and we'll continue.
You earned them.
We're continuing to, and the most Michelin stars, so we're continuing to build on that basis. But just seeing how people have changed, and they adapt very quickly. What I found with Chinese people, especially with Chinese consumers, is how quickly they've climbed the consumption ladder. So again, with government policies, it's going to take a bit of time, but it's in the right direction.
Dr. Shi?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there are 2 points I would like to make. One, to Elaine's point, I think she is right. There's been a lot of Chinese investment overseas, probably, well, a little bit too much. But I think the point is not the quantity, it's the quality. I do have a lot of concern for those investments overseas. I think, well, there might be a lot of reasons for, Elaine, Andrew, all of you must know that, there are some reasons I don't want to talk about, but a lot of people just want to probably transfer the asset to, but so there you see some kind of, you have seen that the investment, overseas investment has surged so much, and some of those investments were not, making economic sense. That's exactly what we need to fix. And I think what happened in later last year, the regulation on the foreign investment, outbound investment. I think it has good reason, and so I think going forward, I think you're going to see more rational international investment or overseas investment from China side, and I think that's a good development. That's a positive development. I think any good international overseas investment from the Chinese enterprises or whatever should make economic sense. It should make money. Simple, right? If you don't make money in the immediate term, you have to make money in the medium to long term, kind of landscape. So I think so you're going to see more rational, overseas investment going forward, which I think is absolutely positive. And as long as the investment is making economic sense, I don't think it's intimidating or it's bad for anybody. It's good for everybody. That's number one. Secondly, I encourage you guys to read an article recently published by Jeffrey Sachs. Mm-hmm. Very interesting article, very enlightening. The title of the article is the shift of global landscape, something like that. What he was basically talking about was that just thanks to Adam Smith's theory, that there is a possibility that the kind of developing countries or like late movers might someday catch up with developed countries, and therefore it's a blessing to the world. And so there was, European century, and there has been American century. And his point is that there won't be a China century or Indian century. It will be just, a world century, or because the economies will be so much interwoven, you cannot really, tell, much difference between, one economy from another one, because there's so much, interwoven. And that's probably a blessing to the world. And I firmly believe this is going to happen. And just because all this kind of economic activities or overseas investments, from CIC's point of view, I just had an interview with you. I said we're going to invest in those probably technologies or products or services or business models which can be applied to China, and we can help improve Chinese economic efficiency and upgrade our economy or industries, as well as helping the home countries. And those technologies may not be cutting edge technology. It might be technology which are already obsolete in those places. I mean, look at John Deere or A.O. Smith, right? And they're having such a new life in China. I mean, A.O. Smith had 30% of their sales, global sales in China. GM sells more cars in China than in the United States today. So what's wrong about that? I think it's good for everybody.
Mike, you've been encouraged, haven't you?
I have been. I mean, I think, but I think Dr. Chi's point about the global economy is really well taken. We're here to talk about China, but 6 or 7 years ago, we had 10 regional editions of Forbes. Today we have 36. And it's really rooted in emerging economies in places like Africa, other parts of Asia. There are many reflections on those economies growing. One of them that's important to us is when the economy reaches a certain point, they want Forbes. They want Forbes to tell stories of success and entrepreneurs and what they're doing, how they're building businesses, what they're seeing, how they're succeeding, and then what they're doing ultimately with the success that they achieve. So it is good. It's good for us. The Asian approach to wealth is different, which we've adjusted to. More often than not, in the United States, I'll run into someone who's on one of our rich lists, and they'll kind of, a la The Godfather, they'll say, "Can you get me off that list? I don't want to, sorry, can't help you. Give all your money away. Get off the list." In Asia, and particularly in China, more often, I'll be asked why I'm getting the number wrong and why it's so low. I know my own finances. You say I've got $2 billion. I know I've got more. If you said $5 billion, it'd still be $2 billion. Exactly. So it's all interwoven, and there are many, I think, businesses that this movement away from the U.S. centricity is benefiting, and we're one of them.
When we talk about China, I mean, it's important to go beyond the government. Let's take a look at China Inc., the likes of Alibaba, Huawei, Xiaomi. They're expanding their wings, lots of M&As. Are you concerned, Elaine, what that means to the global economy?
No, I'm not, because but before I answer that question, one point we haven't addressed here is the reality of demographics, in the sense that if you think of the Chinese leadership, the Chinese political leadership, as well as most of the SOE leadership, are individuals who were not schooled in the West, did not grow up in the West, never worked in the West in terms of management. Xi Bin, however, did both and is of the generation that is leading that in terms of being able to bring the best between the West and the East. And so you can't forget that when you really think about what's going on in China today. The second point I'd make is that the one that Secretary Mnuchin made this morning is that we all want and will benefit from China in being successful, but we hope that China will become as open in terms of markets and investments as the US will. But that, in fact, will take time. When CICC was founded in 1995 as the first joint venture investment bank between China and the US, it was in fact to help that first round of state-owned enterprise reform and restructuring. I would never have imagined that we would come as far as we have in the last 22 years. But when we talk about Alibaba, Fosun, Xiaomi, and others, I think you have to understand that it is part of the government's national policy to create global national champions. And that's part of the political agenda. That's part of their economic agenda. And quite frankly, the government will support and invest in terms of doing that. Many of these, quote, private sector conglomerates still are supported by preferential lending or within the economy. So they are private sector companies, if you will, but they're not completely disassociated from the government. In the US, there is a much clearer distinction between the government and the corporate sector. And in China's development, they've been much more intertwined. Where and how that develops in the future remains to be seen.
Part of government agenda, but not necessarily wrong. I mean, if you take a look at the funds getting into Hollywood, for instance, right? I mean, you see a lot of Chinese companies now investing in producing films. I mean, what effects have we seen? What impact has there been?
Well, I guess this film sector and my sector are, kind of related because it's entertainment and, but at the same time, on Elaine's point, I think while there are some national champions like Tencent and Alibaba and those guys, but those are really private enterprises and private businesses. I would actually argue that if the Chinese government was more behind some of their other companies, like mine, for instance, I operate in a highly regulated industry. And I know for a fact that my competitors are very often, their governments are firmly behind them in terms of the development of their businesses. So for instance, President Trump brought both my direct competitors, Steve Wynn and Sheldon Adelson, to meet Prime Minister Abe to try to get them a gaming license. I wouldn't even think that the Chinese president would bring me, ever.
Did you ask?
I don't even have the channel to ask. And I'm a CPPCC national member. So I'm in the top 2,000 people of the advisory board. And I guess on one hand, yes, China is trying to spread its capital and wallet to influence certain enterprises. But I think if one day China really said, you know what, some of the bigger companies, we're going to support them in further development globally, I think that's going to be another leg in terms of how the global economy will change. And I'm still holding out hope for that. But in terms of just going back to the entertainment industry and Hollywood, I actually would say, in line with what the doctor said, there are some foolish investments. And when you see steel companies and metal companies investing in Hollywood and trying to, there's a consensus that somehow China is going to change culture and through Hollywood. I think that's a long way away. Because
do you agree? Can Chinese funds help shape the culture and?
I don't think that the investments that have been made so far have had any kind of direct product impact.
Do you think
AMC theaters may be a little bit of a different experience than it was a couple of years ago. But I think from a content standpoint, as our owners have, they've left us alone in terms of product creation. They're not leaving us alone relative to profitability and performance and return on investment, which is as it should be. But there's been little influence on the content that we create. I think in relative terms, at least so far, it's a small part of the planned or unplanned movement to superpower economic status. I think it's going to be fascinating because through all the ups and downs and ins and outs of America in U.S. in the information economy and in the industrial age, the one thing we always took great pride in was pointing to culture and arts and letters and film and entertainment as a reflection of that. How dramatically it will change, I suspect not as much as we might think as quickly, but it will, as time goes by, have impact. The world's becoming a smaller place in every way.
And I think on that related note, not so much the investments in film is going to directly change the culture, but China is already 30% of the global luxury goods sector in terms of consumption. So whether they like it or not, the likes of Louis Vuitton, Dior, Kering Group, they are morphing their offerings more to suit the Chinese public, because ultimately it's 30% of their entire business. And like my business as well, we need to be tailor-made for our Chinese customer base, because ultimately we want to be ahead of the curve, but at the same time we don't want to be too far ahead of the curve, because then we're alienating our own customers. So I think one way or the other, it's getting there, but again, the world is becoming a smaller and smaller place, but at the same time, all the businesses need to be more accustomed to adapting themselves for the Chinese audience.
With China rising, how can there be a more productive relationship between the US and China? Dr. Chen.
Can I just quickly make a comment on the film
Sure.
thing? I do have a lot of reservation for those people who come to Hollywood to buy up companies. I don't know what they are doing, And I think they thought they can increase their sales or their marketing in China just by adding, two servants who happen to be Chinese in an American movie. That's kind of ridiculous, I mean, I think, and that's not going to improve Chinese culture or modernize China in any way. I think the best way to improve Chinese, culture is just like what Korean people did. They send their students to study in the States, so they learn the Western way of telling stories, and then they went back to Korea to tell Korean stories, because Korean stories could be pretty complicated or different from American stories. That should be, how China improve our entertainment industry and the film industry. I honestly speaking, I'm so disappointed by China's filming and the entertainment industry in general. I mean, I go to movie theater because my daughter wanted to go there. But I couldn't even finish watching those movies. It's so,
On the point of education,
right.
On the point of education, which Qibin mentions, I think there's some fabulous numbers that you have to think about. First of all, what's the number? 10 million students go to college,
Right.
graduate every year.
Right.
And as you may know, in China, it's a 3-day exam, national exam, for high school graduates. It's in 7 sections. One section of that is English proficiency. So when you think of the millions of students that are now going to school or to college that have English proficiency, reverse that and think about how many American students have that same proficiency in Chinese. So there are more Chinese students studying abroad than there are US students studying in China.
For sure.
So from that perspective, we have a long way to go in this country in terms of really interconnecting these cultures. I think the business leaders have been at the forefront of that. The politicians have their own issues. The business leaders have really driven this, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Unfortunately, I think they just stopped that. So the students don't have to take.
They don't have to take English anymore?
Right. And
that's the new administration.
I think that's wrong. But anyway, I think Chinese students should learn more to understand the rest of the world and be more modernized over time. Another point on the business expansion overseas for private companies in China. I never worked in Tencent or Alibaba or Huawei. I don't know how much Chinese government influence on them, but I think most of the Chinese companies' overseas investment is from their own purpose or their competition need. Because in China, the most of the products or technologies, you have to keep in mind, China being the second largest economy in the world, the productivity of Chinese economy, according to different standards, there are like people are saying it's 1/14 of US or 1/7 of US or 1/5 of US. Even though if it's 1/5 of US, it's just so much difference, and therefore I think the economy, the two economies, they're so much complementary to each other, and there's so much space you can collaborate than anything else. So a Chinese company want to learn or buy the advanced technology. It might be, as I mentioned, might be obsolete in the States, but it's still relatively advanced in China. Once one of the companies buys up that technology, then all of his competitors in China just finished. So that's their intention to go about buying businesses or technology around the world. They're not going trying to go about just to conquer the world. That's absurd, So I think a lot of the business people are just go about buying those things, but they don't have they don't have the knowledge, or they don't. Sometimes they just don't know how to do it. Therefore, it looks like quite awkward. So that's what how I look at this thing. There might be some Chinese government influence, but I don't think that's explained that much. But you had a question for me.
Yes, I do. I did.
What was that question?
How do you
Good
ensure
answer.
a more productive relationship within the US and China, given China's rise?
Well, I mean, China's rise. I mean, I'm kind of reserved for this word. I think China had quite a good economic growth or success, and I don't think China has risen to whatever level or anything scary or intimidating. I think the best way to for me, from my point of view, I think the best way to ensure a better relationship between China and the US is to have more economic engagement. That's probably the ultimate solution between the two largest economies in the world. Therefore, I think we should, in China, we should encourage more Chinese investment overseas, but as I mentioned, in a more rational level, rational manner. And I think the US should also encourage Chinese investment in those sectors which can help both countries. Of course, Elaine touched upon a good point that China should open up more. I totally agree. I spent 16 years with CSRC, the Chinese regulator, in the security markets, and I've been promoting this opening up process all over these years. We opened up the Q fee, our Q fee. We opened up. We launched the Shanghai Hong Kong Stock Connect, Shenzhen Hong Kong Stock Connect.
But still not fast enough, though, Dr.
Right. I mean, just imagine. just look. Just give you just one small point. Last year, when we launched the Shenzhen Shanghai Stock Connect, that was after the 2015 crisis, right? And China lifted the total quota requirement. I think that was quite courageous, to be honest. And so I think the participation of foreign capital in Chinese capital market, as one example, is so small. It's almost pathetic. It's 1.69%. And just for comparison purpose, Japan 30%, Korea 25%, and US probably 27%. So I think there's a lot of room for expansion, and I think that's good for China, at least in my point of view. Also in the financial services area, I think we should expand further, open up further, because we need a good company to be in Chinese capital market to compete, so that Chinese financial company can get better. As simple as that. I mean, look at the Chinese soccer team. I mean, how pathetic, right? Because we don't have competition. You just have to invite German, soccer team, or Brazilian soccer team to come to China to compete, so that Chinese soccer team. Probably you guys don't know about Chinese soccer team. The whole nation is so much enthusiastic about soccer, but every time they just, failed in a terrible way. So.
As the U.S. has learned, it takes hundreds of years to become a good soccer power.
Well,
You just get it started.
I hope we can. We don't need 100 years.
Elaine, your thoughts on how the relationship between the US and China can be more productive than what it is today?
Well, as I said, I think great inroads have been made on the business-to-business level. And I was in Beijing when China was going to enter the WTO. And we at Morgan Stanley were pushing for financial services access. But no one else on Wall Street cared about China in those days. And so, quite frankly, Larry Summers in his wisdom said, well, we'll get to this later. And I often think about if, in fact, financial services had been included in WTO, we would have a very different landscape today in terms of that. But that said, the development of the Chinese capital markets over the last 20 years have been nothing short of extraordinary. And things that took us 100 years, quite frankly, have gotten done in 20. But think about that also. There is not a body of regulation or a group of regulators in China that have had that global experience in terms of markets, et cetera. So it is developing simultaneously to that. But what I'm always shocked about is really what's the brain trust within the policy-making organizations of the United States that really have knowledge and experience in China? There aren't any. There are very few. And so, you know, as I often asked in the last administration, who's leading China policy? You know, we can ask that again in this administration, but it's too soon to say. So there is just a very large knowledge and experiential gap in terms of policymakers with respect to China. Now, in China, as we know as observers, policies can change, and can change very rapidly and overnight. Okay, be it the education thing that you mentioned that I was unaware of, and others. So that makes it very difficult for those outside of China to really understand what's going on, because many times it seems like there's a lot of micromanagement that goes on day to day.
How important, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Kind
No,
of an
go ahead.
elephant in the room, maybe it's, I'm just curious what the other panelists think in terms of commingling the economies and working for the benefit of both. Has President Trump and President Xi's visit, will it have, can it have, if it sustains, you know, he's a good guy, we like each other.
Well, that's a good starting point.
Yeah, it is a good, well, this seems to be what everybody's saying. It's certainly better than he came to town and was offended or left mad or whatever. But how much effect can it have? What will it take? I watch it with bemusement, but also a great deal of hope. Exactly.
Well, I think we need to, seriously, I think obviously the two presidents had a very good meeting, no matter what. I think what we need to do is try to, you know, implement a few things, or many things, if possible, just to institutionalize those kind of good relationship. Therefore, I think we need to help both sides to identify a few areas where we can make things, you know, happen, you know, in a concrete way. For example, I mean, I would like to just throw out some ideas just for, you know, entertainment purpose, maybe. For example, Chinese, you know, financial institutions can couple with U.S. financial institutions, and so it's going to be like joint effort to invest in, let's say, Midwest states in particular in the manufacturing sector, where a lot of companies might be having a difficult time in the States because there might be, you know, mature technology or probably just shrinking business, and then we can expand the China market for them. And by doing that, I think we're helping Chinese economy to, you know, upgrade the industry at the same time benefiting the blue-collar workers in the States, so that it's going to be totally win-win. And I'm sure, I mean, for Rust Belt areas or Midwest states, there are plenty of opportunities like that. I mean, things from John Deere. I mean, John Deere sells 10% of tractors in China. In the U.S., probably no farmer, well, very few farmers are going to drive, I mean, tractors anymore. But in China, John Deere is called the BMW tractor. And the Chinese farmers have just begun to drive the BMW tractors. I mean, so they have many, many years of prosperity going forward. And so John Deere sells 10% of tractor in China among hundreds of tractor builders in manufacturing in China. So they're number one. But John Deere's China sales only 2% of their global sales. I told them, I said, how pathetic. Come on. I mean, what a shame. You should make it at least 10%, 20%, if not 50%. So there's so much room for improvement. So we can do many things from agricultural machinery to industrial machinery like Caterpillar, to Medtronic, which is going to have a huge potential in China, to Eli Lilly, to GM, many companies. So that's one idea we can do, and we can even bring in the pension funds of those Midwest states workers, so that everybody will be have a kind of economic gain from those investments. Secondly, I think infrastructure. We had a big session today on infrastructure, but nobody talked about China. That's kind of sad. Come on, look at the high-speed rail in China, high-speed train in China. Everybody here takes the train from New York to Boston will be pissed. And in China, the high-speed rail and high-speed train, they're number one, fast. Number two, very smooth. Number three, it's very, very cheap. If you build it the cost of building high-speed rail for Chinese company is probably like, let's say 19. For Japan, it's 25. For Europe, it's 38. For Americans, 56. So number one, it's cheap. Secondly, it's good quality. What's wrong about having Chinese company come to US to build high-speed rail for US, right? You can manufacture, semiconductor, cutting-edge technology and export to China. Elaine can go to China to do financial services. Of course, you're now working for a Chinese company. Well, you can someday bring Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley to China. So it's about exchange of comparative advantage. And if you go to travel to the western part of China, I forgot one thing about high-speed train, high-speed rail. In China, China now has 70% of the high-speed rail of the entire world. It's all over the places. And so you can travel to any city in China on a high-speed train. It's comfortable. Once you get used to it, you don't want to take flight anymore because it's so unpredictable. And also, if you travel to the western part of China, you drive on the highway and the bridges, they're like 500 meter high, and they can complete it within like 2-3 months. It's good quality, it's cheap. Why not?
Because democracy is messy, and 50 states create
I know,
a lot of challenges to
and just to make sure
infrastructure.
that it's going to be easily acceptable or meet the least resistance in the states, we can have U.S. capital and the China capital like 50%. Number one. Secondly, we can have a contract which says it has to hire at least 50% of the local workers to work on those high-speed train or high-speed rail. So there will be solutions. So I think to solidify the good relationship, good intention between the two presidents, I think we need to come up with some concrete plan to get things done, and so that those good intention or goodwill will be institutionalized.
Great.
I want to touch on the leadership transition, because earlier, Elaine, you talked about how policies change and they can change overnight. What are you looking out for when it comes to the leadership transformation that's happening in China?
Well, this is obviously a pivotal year, and my colleague can probably speak more to it. The process in China may not, since a lot of the decision making as to who the future leaders are not necessarily done in an open and transparent fashion. Therefore, it leaves a lot of opacity with respect to where the emerging power leaders will come from. Maybe from inside China you have a better view, but from outside it's very difficult to see.
Maybe we'll get Lawrence's opinion on this leadership transition.
Look,
You sit on the committee.
Even though I sit on the CPPCC committee, our role is more of advisory in terms of what we see in the rest of the world and what suggestions we have. But in terms of the transition, I agree with Elaine. Ultimately, it's one party in China. You don't have Democrats and Republicans, one party. And whatever infighting or lobbying or positioning, it's happening from within inside. And of course, President Xi has assembled unrivaled power in the last 30 years with the various campaigns that he has undertaken. I can't claim to be an expert on this field, so I would defer throw the ball over to Dr. C over there.
Is it a risk, the way the world views it, this leadership transition? Is it as big a risk as we make it out to be?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at China, you look at a lot of you might look at those specific, as you mentioned, some transition or whatever. I think the way I look at it, I look at it probably in a more like longer perspective. You have to look at the daily, progress, which is happening every single day in China. You're seeing people are having, a lot more wealth than before. You've seen China, as Andrew mentioned, that 30-some years ago, 20-some years ago, probably when we were like kids, we couldn't even have enough food. Now China, back in the 80s, there was one American who wrote a book on, who is going to feed 800 million Chinese, which was very popular in the West. And now China has 1.3, as you say, 1.5 billion people. I think half of the people are trying to lose weight. What happened? I think the story about Chinese growth is not about like some magic, powerful. I mean, Mr. Deng, of course, did a lot of, a great contribution to that. But I think the story about Chinese growth, be it agriculture or automobile or just consumer electronics, it's about liberalization. I think so. I think what you should focus on is whether China is keep liberalizing, particularly in the economic sector. As long as we have that, I think we're pretty relatively safe.
And the sense is that it will continue to or not?
Of course. I think what happened in the last 30 years was China to keep liberalize a few economic sectors, agriculture, and as I mentioned, automobile, or consumer electronics. Going forward, there are many fields China should liberalize and will liberalize. For example, education, medical. If today in China, just see how poor Chinese medical system is. Every time you go to hospital, and you have to navigate through millions of people, and then it's going to take forever to go to see a doctor. If you are lucky enough, you have to have connection, the guanxi or something to see a doctor. And at the same time, there are millions of medical students who couldn't even find a job because the system is not market-based, so they cannot allocate the resources by itself. So imagine if you liberalize the medical industry and the education industry and probably let's say financial industry. China's financial industry is so I don't think it's I think it needs liberalized. And there will be so much potential. If we have that, I think we're going to have probably another 20, 30 years of economic growth. And if you look at if you compare the different countries, different nations, there's one parameter you should focus on: per capita GDP. If one country, let's say it's $1,000 per capita GDP, I don't know, it's probably Indian right now. If you look at China, like 20, 30 years ago, it's very similar. I'm not saying India is like 30 years behind China, but if a lot of the sectors, I think it's very similar to 20 years of China ago, 10 years ago, China. And now China's $8,000 per capita GDP. Taiwan is 25,000. Korea is 30,000. Japan is 40,000. US is 50,000. So we want to see China progress in this way. You're going to see more and more affluent and also more civilized society, but not just a bigger and bigger economy, but it just has to be more civilized society.
Before we take questions from the floor, Mike, maybe just your views on what you're looking out for in this transition.
I think consistency is really important, and for the most part, certainly we focused on the economies of the various countries in the world, and I think what I personally feel that what's happening has been good, and I hope that we don't have some kind of radical reversal.
So you don't see a risk in this?
I don't know that I don't see a risk. Where I was heading with that is I don't see a risk in it from an economics standpoint. We haven't talked as much about military and global threats. And I think that the curveballs that can come from that, we haven't had on the table, and they're very, very difficult to anticipate. But I think from an economic standpoint, I would anticipate that the transition would embrace what's happened and try to continue it. And again, I'd use the word hope.
We're happy to take questions, please.
Dr. Chi, I was wondering if you might be able to share a little bit of your views in terms of, if you look at the U.S. currently, in relative attractiveness of private equity, private credit, public equities, VC, where do you see the most attractive opportunities? And Andrew, I was wondering if you could also comment a little bit on Macau and how you think the next 3 years might play out a little bit in terms of the future and the government relationship.
Well, I really cannot comment on the different asset classes for the U.S. market from just any investor's point of view, but I can comment on from CIC's point of view, because we are CIC, we're China Investment Corporation. So when we look at a U.S. market, we understand that we have history has really proven that we had a hard time competing with our competitors in the States in the public markets. So I wouldn't think that public markets is where we can give ourselves the best return. So we will be more focusing on a less efficient market like private equity market and VC market, or probably just direct investment area. But we're just not going to go there blindly. We have to go somewhere where we can have an edge. So I always say that we need to go invest in something from the in the U.S. economy or the U.S. Private equity market, where we can bring the portfolio companies to marry with Chinese counterpart or Chinese consumer market. So that will be our focus.
And I think in terms of my questions, naturally, we're headquartered in Macau, and we have businesses in Manila and Russia, and we recently won a monopoly in the EU. The Chinese consumer base is just massive. I think last year the outbound tourists from China was 122 million people versus 75 million in the US. And even at 122 million, that's less than 10% of the population base. And these people are becoming more and more affluent. 60% of these people traveling outwards are traveling on an individual basis rather than part of group tours. And so what we're seeing in Macau as well is that, again, and I mentioned it early on, people are becoming more sophisticated. And they want better things, and they don't want the tacky things that they liked 10 years ago, and they are climbing that consumption ladder very, very quickly. And some of the issues we saw with the anti-extravagant, anti-corruption crackdown, the gaming business in Macau was collateral damage together with the rest of the global luxury goods. The Louis Vuittons, the Pradas of the world, everybody got hit because that campaign, and we see a high correlation between that campaign and their spending at our properties, because you don't get more aspirational than the gaming and resorts business.
Any other questions?
This gentleman.
Oh, please.
Thank you. Yeah, hi there. My name's Colin Tater. I'm from Connexus Financial in Australia. That's a little country in the South Pacific, not the one next to Switzerland. We've been breathed into us the last couple of years by our government to play equal parts with the United States and with China, that we can play in the same playground. Trade is critical with both, communications critical with both, defence is critical with both, etc. That's just a comment. My question is, I can't help but think during a very interesting conversation, would this be a very different conversation if it was about the rise, let's say, of Britain again, with 1.2 billion, white English-speaking Anglo-Saxon people? How different would the conversation be, or would we be having the conversation at all, especially when it comes to the Trump rhetoric?
I think Brexit has ruled that out for the next couple of years as a major possibility. But I think the dynamics of language are really fascinating. 5 years ago, I thought that a big piece of Forbes' business is brand licensing, and I felt we could have a Forbes school of business in China and specialize in teaching business English, because everyone viewed it as the #1 business tool that you needed. And our research is showing us exactly what you'd said before, that it's less and less important. And I don't know where the inflection point's going to become, but I think learning Mandarin is going to be maybe the way that reflects. I'd answer your question. Maybe we should all learn a little bit of Mandarin.
Well, I mean, just for the language thing, I think, well, even though I think more and more, people in the West are trying to learn Mandarin, I still insist that #1, learning English is very important for China. Secondly, it's just there's so many people who are trying to learn English or having their kids learn English. I had a conversation with Larry Summers when he was visiting China last year, and I said, well, we were talking about how we can, tackle the problem for, the working class in, Midwest, because, this kind of global competition. And I said, well, of course, I say you guys should do, Larry should do more, because, your government, you should provide the funding for retraining for those workers. They have to learn new skills. But even you don't do that. You can just ask the American workers to come to China to teach English. Mm-hmm. And he thought I was joking. Well, average English tutor in Beijing earns probably like 800 RMB, which is like $150-ish per hour. And they would have like a whole day, booked, 7 days a week. So they're making so much money, much more than they can ever imagine here in the States, because there's so much demand for tutors like that. And let me give you one number. The population, the number of people who are learning English in China is bigger than the entire U.S. population. Can you believe that? Mm-hmm. And therefore, their company who does online English tutoring, and there are so many kids sign up for that. Parents, right? And I know at least 10 websites, 10 companies which does that, and the worth billions of dollars the valuation. Mm-hmm. And my daughter tried to learn English online. She couldn't even get in, even we pay so much money. There was like one slot, and there were like, hundreds of kids bidding for the slot.
But one thing that's critical to all of this is more than the language, is if you think about what have been some of the great successful multinational corporations around the world, it's because they've been multinational. It's because they have hired employees from various countries and trained them in global management skills in large organizations. At this point, for the most part, many of the Chinese corporations still are primarily Chinese. Yeah. And there needs to be a greater hiring of global employees, because that will benefit not only the Chinese entity, but also those foreign employees that are working. And that will come, but that is something that is still markedly different. But I think that's happening little by little. Not as fast as it should, though.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Mm-hmm. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's been very insightful. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Lawrence, Elaine, Mike, Dr. Chu, thank you.
Thank you.